Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined by Keith Preston to discuss something of which he is very familiar, anarchist infighting. What is an anarchist? So, oftentimes in ancient Egypt, the pharaoh would hire other artisans to scratch out the inscriptions in face of other pharaohs to write him out of history. And anarchists do the same thing. They like to write each other out of history. So, if you're more of a secular bent Christian anarchist like Tolstoy and others aren't really anarchists, anarcho-capitalists aren't really anarchists. They're just crypto statists because they love capitalism. But according to anarcho-capitalists, anarcho-communists are crypto statists because they're communist. And so, let's define what is an anarchist, Keith.
Well, probably the first caveat I would have to add is that if you get 200 people in a meeting room who claim to be anarchists, and ask them for a definition of anarchism, by the time the discussion is over, you're probably going to have at least 300 or 400 different definitions. So, it's like every individual who is a self-identified anarchist seems to have their own definition and often multiple definitions at the same time. Now, on a basic level, there's a different ways you can approach this. The most obvious one is you could say that an anarchist is somebody who simply disbelieves in the legitimacy of the state. And that is often considered to be the foundation of anarchism for many types of anarchists. Some anarchists say that's not enough, or you have to have more than that. But probably the one thing, if there is any one thing that unites all types of anarchist thought, is that the state is a fundamentally illegitimate institution because the state is basically the mafia with a flag. That's a common saying among anarchists, or at least many types of anarchists. The state is really just organized crime, and it maintains an ideological superstructure to legitimize itself, but it's really no different than the Gambinos or something like that. So the state is an inherently illegitimate institution, and typically you have anarchists will say that instead they favor voluntary association, voluntary cooperation. Some are less oriented towards the voluntarist angle and more towards the egalitarian angle. They'll say, well, there shouldn't be hierarchical authority over anyone. And they'll extend that not just to the state, but to other institutions as well. They'll have a critique of business and industry and organized religion, or even family, or different kinds of institutions. Of course, there are narrower versions of what anarchism is. There are certain types of anarchists who say, no, anarchism is simply a branch of 19th century socialism. And if you're not about organizing workers to take control of the means of production with a system of worker self-management of the means of production, then you're not an anarchist. So basically, from that viewpoint, only anarcho-syndicalists and anarcho-communists are anarchists, and everything else is something else. There are broader definitions of anarchism in the sense that anybody who has a generally anti-authoritarian outlook, or anyone who favors a radically decentralized political system, or somebody who favors a political system that is not monocentric, that's polycentric, someone who favors a system of direct democracy, somebody who favors cooperative economic arrangements, people who live an anarchistic lifestyle of, however that would be defined. These are other definitions as well. And I don't know that any one of them is inherently correct. I tend to lean more towards the view that there was a left-wing anarchist, Alejandro de Acosta, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said something like, anarchism is a decentralized federation of philosophies, movements, ways of life, practices, communities, geohistories, meaning different regions of the world have their own anarchist traditions and things like that. And he was an anarchist of the left, Alejandro de Acosta. James Corbett, who was more in the anarcho-capitalist voluntarist camp, he actually said something similar once. He said anarchism is sort of not just one idea, but it's sort of an ecosystem of ideas that intersect with each other in various ways, but differ in other ways. One of the earliest scholars to really examine modern anarchist thought from a value-neutral perspective was there was a German law student back in the late 19th century when classical anarchism was at its peak, a guy named Paul Elsbacher, and he actually did his PhD dissertation in law on anarchism. And the way he did it was that he examined the thought of what I call the Big Seven, that is the leading anarchist theoreticians of the 19th century. Well, William Godwin was one of them. That's 18th century. But William Godwin, Proudhon, Bakunin, Kropotkin, Tucker, Tolstoy, and Stirner. And he came to the conclusion, Paul Elsbacher came to the conclusion that really anarchism, just those seven anarchists really represented different philosophies and different ideologies, that even those weren't really the same thing. And I came across another political scientist some years ago who once said that there are probably about as many schools of anarchism as there are other political ideologies put together. And that's maybe an exaggeration, but only a slight one, I think. So this is a fairly open-ended philosophy in many ways, anarchism or anarchisms. But at the same time, as with most other types of philosophy, you have those who prefer a narrow definition and those who favor a broad definition.
Okay, so with that in mind, Keith, do you prefer the narrow or the broad definition for your own practical use?
Well, definitely a broad definition. I tend to lean towards the idea that Murray Bookchin had, which is that there was this concept he developed called a legacy of freedom, arguing that going all the way back to antiquity, you have lengthy history of people and groups and individuals fighting against oppressive authority, oppressive institutions, and things of that nature. And it wasn't just Bookchin that had this idea. Among classical anarchism thinkers, for example, Max Natlau, who was a historian of anarchism, the idea developed that you can trace the roots of anarchist thought all the way back to Axial Age era philosophy, strands of ancient Greek philosophy, ancient Chinese philosophy, and some Judaic philosophy, some Hindu philosophy. So I tend to lean more in that kind of direction, that it's this idea of this pan-anti-authoritarian historical trajectory, and it finds its formal expression as anarchism, properly denoted in the 19th century, as an outgrowth of the radical philosophies that came out of the Enlightenment and things like that.
Okay, so which groups that call themselves anarchists, or maybe even don't, would you actually consider anarchists? Because, like, for example, we have people that are close. So let's look at the libertarian movement, right? There are some libertarians that would actually self-identify as anarchists, but there are some libertarians who are minarchists who would support a minimal state. So libertarianism would cross the anarchist status divide, because libertarians have people on both sides. So I guess, who would you include in the larger definition of anarchist as okay, this is a good contender for an anarchist person, and then who would just be this person cannot be considered an anarchist for X, Y, and Z reasons?
Well, as a general rule, if somebody tells me that they consider themselves to be an anarchist, I'm like, okay, they're an anarchist, unless there's a really compelling reason to think otherwise. But for the most part, if somebody tells me they're an anarchist, then they're an anarchist. So most people that I just self-identify as anarchist, I give them the benefit of the doubt. Now, as far as philosophies that are similar to anarchism, but aren't really denoted as anarchism, there's quite a few of those. Anarchism has many, many, I guess you could call them cousin ideologies. And there are plenty of things that aren't really called anarchism that are very similar. For example, the transcendental philosophy of Henry David Thoreau. Henry David Thoreau, that wrote a famous essay on civil disobedience. He was a 19th century American writer. He was an anarchist in all but name. They didn't really have a lot of people called anarchists back then, but he was or could have been one. If you look at a lot of the ideas of Gandhi in his Satyagraha philosophy, this is essentially an Indian version of anarchism, although it wasn't really called that as far as I know, but certainly it's very similar in practice. There are tendencies within Buddhism, there are tendencies within Taoism and other Chinese or Asian philosophies that are very similar to anarchism. There are ancient Greek philosophies, as I mentioned earlier, that are very similar. For example, the Zeno's Republic, if you read that, it's basically a blueprint for anarcho-communism, even though it wasn't called that at the time. And some of the medieval movements that had a sort of a Christian orientation. Some of those could certainly be considered, I think, prototypes or predecessors for anarchism. So there are a lot of things that aren't really labeled anarchism that amount to the same thing in practice. And of course, like as I said, you have these cousin philosophies. Like a menarchist, I would say, is a cousin to an anarchist. A libertarian socialist is a cousin to an anarchist, even though it's not really the same thing in a strictly defined sense.
So so as a term, I think anarchist and anarchism was developed in the 19th century. What movements, if any, would you consider prior to that? Because right, you might actually be anarchist, but before the name is developed, you're not going to be called that, right? So is there anybody before the labeling convention that you would consider, okay, this person or these people were anarchists, but the name just wasn't around at the time, so they were called something else?
Well, the first person to use the term anarchist to describe his viewpoint that I know of in history was Pierre Joseph Proudhon. Most historians of anarchism say he's the first well-known thinker to call himself an anarchist. Max Stirner and William Godwin actually precede Proudhon historically and were writing before Proudhon. And they were anarchists in all but name, particularly William Godwin. If you read his work, he's sort of a prototypical anarcho-communist. Stirner comes close to being an individualist anarchist, or he wasn't really that economics oriented, but he comes close to being an anarcho-capitalist in many ways. So certainly those guys. There were other early socialists that had very similar views. One was a guy named Joseph de Jacques. He's widely credited with the idea, with having invented the term libertarian, but he was very similar in thought to the anarcho-communists. Some of the utopian socialists, like Charles Fourier, they were fairly similar to the anarcho-communists. You also had other thinkers, radical classical liberals, that were very similar to what today would be called libertarian anarchism or individualist anarchism. For example, Paul-Émile Dupuy, who was the guy who developed the concept of anarchism. There was Gustave Molinari, who had the idea of a voluntarist cooperative state, very similar to modern voluntarism. Frederick Bastiat, he was more like a modern libertarian, more like a menarchist, really, than an anarchist. But of course, we can turn the clock a lot further. Edmund Burke had an essay called "The Vindication of Natural Society," that's essentially anarchist, and even if it's not called that. Now, later in life, he said he only meant that as a parody of radicals or something like that. But I kind of doubt that. I think he was just trying to cover his own position, saying, "Oh, I didn't really mean all that stuff." But and then, of course, you go back further than that. You go back to the early modern period, or you go back to the Middle Ages. You have the Diggers. The Diggers are very much prototypical anarcho-communists. To some degree, the Levelers are fairly similar to the ideas of modern libertarian anarchists. You can go back to some of the millenarian movements of the Middle Ages. What is it, the Brethren of the Free Spirit or something? I think that's one. You had a lot of these mystical Christian-influenced movements that came out of the Middle Ages that were very similar in content to modern anarchism. And as I've already mentioned, some of the examples from ancient China, ancient Greece. We could talk about examples from the Islamic world and ancient Persia and all of that as well. So these are ideas that go back for a long, long time, but they've just been called different things at different points in history.
Right. So using a broader scope definition of anarchism, this is, I think, one possible, given the known schools, right? You could say broadly there's three groups: right, left, and Christian. Right anarchists would be like the egoists, like Max Stirner, American individualist anarchism, like we saw with Spooner and Tucker, and then maybe American anarcho-capitalism. Left anarchism would be anarcho-syndicalism, anarcho-communism, and related themes. And then Christian anarchism is usually what's associated with people like Leo Tolstoy. Would you broadly accept that as correct?
Yeah, although I'd probably add some more categories. As far as those that are derivative from spiritual or religious traditions, in many ways, I think those need a category of their own. In many ways, I would say Christian anarchism, Islamic anarchism, Buddhist anarchism, Taoist anarchism, in many ways have their own paradigm, because or Jewish anarchism or pagan anarchism, because those are all uniquely rooted in specific ideas that are rooted in these religious and spiritual traditions. That's one thing. As far as right anarchism, um, you also have these people that call themselves things like anarcho-monarchists and anarcho-nationalists and things of that nature. And of course, those are widely disliked by other anarchists. But I do think there's a quasi-anarchist dimension when you go and you look into what some of their ideas are. And I'm more inclined to think that that's really the right wing of anarchism. And it's something like libertarian anarchism, individualist anarchism, anarcho-capitalism. That's more like a centrist liberal version of anarchism. And then the more socialist influenced versions of anarchism, that's the left wing of anarchism, like anarcho-communism, anarcho-syndicalism, mutualism, and some of that. And then you also have to think about the points of view that have some other kind of orientation, like the green anarchists that are more environmental, ecologically oriented. Technically, that's not really left or right in the conventional sense. You also have these anarcho-primitivists. You could argue that's the most reactionary idea there is. Let's go back to the Pleistocene or whatever. And then you also have the identitarian types of anarchism, like black anarchism, which is sort of an effort to reconcile anarchism with black nationalism. And then you have anarcho-feminism, gender-based anarchism. And many of those, I think, have unique features that are really their own, that you can't really entirely group them together with some of these other philosophies because they really do have a different orientation and foundation.
Because it would seem that, as you've defined it, the say anarchist left and center are primarily economically motivated, whereas the spiritual anarchist tradition is motivated based on spirituality, of course, or you could also have ethnicity, gender, or the environment.
Right. Yeah.
None of those are economic per se, so they're going to be different. So maybe there's like three axes or poles: economics, culture, religion.
Yeah. Although I think ecology might be its own category.
True. Now, this is something that I don't think. Maybe it's impossible, right? Because like reconciling all these anarchists seems like herding cats. But given that each of these anarchist traditions sort of focuses on one or two things and kind of over indexes and kind of leaves other aspects not really discussed, is it conceivable on the one hand and worthwhile on the other to try to build this like unified anarchist theory where like you look at all of them and then look at what they over index on and then what they leave out, you then fill in with what the other guy talks about. So when, the economic oriented anarchists aren't going to talk about spirituality, the spiritual oriented anarchists aren't going to talk about this is like cultural or ecological issues and vice versa. Do you think that's even possible, or is anarchism just too diverse?
Well, I think that in many ways these different points of view are natural complements to each other. It gets back to the idea of paradox, where when paradox is the idea, well, the opposites can actually reflect some underlying unified reality. And I do think that that's an issue with all of these hyphenated forms of anarchism, in the sense that they tend to focus in on some particular topic or problem or issue or whatever, and perhaps in a way that's a bit myopic or one-dimensional. But then they are complemented or corrected for by some other type of anarchism that swings back in the other direction. For example, the obvious example would be anarcho-communist and anarcho-capitalist, individualism versus collectivism, or the primitivist versus the technophile anarchists, or the anti-clerical, militant, anti-church anarchists like Bakunin, and then the religious spiritual anarchists like Dorothy Day or like Tolstoy. And you could keep on with that dichotomy. So I think in some ways these are paradoxes that complement each other. At the same time, as far as the idea of having unity among anarchists, yeah, good luck with that. I think that it would be possible to have an ecumenical type of anarchism that's similar to the way that you have ecumenical churches. An example I like to use, and of course the anti-clerical anarchists wouldn't like this example, but you have the World Council of Churches. Right? The World Council of Churches theoretically is a federation of many different types of church denominations, and they have their standards as to what counts as a Christian church denomination. We believe XXX. But of course, and that's a very large organization, the World Council of Churches, includes all different kinds of things. But then you also have other people who refuse to participate in the World Council of Churches because they'll say, well, no, we don't recognize this church or this other kind of church is in the federation or whatever. So we're just going to do our own thing. And then, of course, you have certain types of churches that most all other churches consider heretical or maybe just cultic or something like that. And I think in anarchism, I think that's something like that is the closest you would ever get to anarchist unity. I could see in the future, in the distant future, someday having a world federation of anarchist organizations and individuals, and that might include all kinds of stuff. But then you'd still have other groups of people who refuse to participate in the federation because because they don't want other people included that they object to, or they think that the federation doesn't add on to enough qualifiers about who a true anarchist is. And human groups generally tend to group off in that kind of direction. In any kind of human group, you have a debate about who should we include and who should we exclude, and how open-ended should our philosophy and value system actually be.
Right. Now, given that we mentioned that other anarchist groups might have myopia or just, too overly focused on one thing, do you think it's possible to have a unified theory of anarchism? So not of people, right, but like a theory that takes all these other anarchist perspectives and sort of like a Hegelian dialectic synthesizes them into this like new unified theory?
Yeah. Well, I think you could actually create a theoretical system like that, but there would be somebody somewhere who is a self-described anarchist who would object to it. And in fact, you could probably create multiple theoretical models of this type. If I were going to try to construct something like that, I'd probably start with force theory. That's a term in political science that's used to describe the origins of the state. But there are different theories about the origins of the state, but the force theory is the idea that the state is simply based on plunder and conquest, and that's how we got states. That gets back to the idea, the anarchist idea, the state is a mafia with a flag. So I think I'd probably start with that, and then you could go and incorporate elements of elite theory. And elite theory can be left wing or right wing, but it's about describing how power elites emerge in institutional systems. Like for example, left wing elite theory, like C. Wright Mills and William Domhoff, they're more interested in identifying who the elites are. Whereas the Machiavellian tradition, like Pareto and Mosca, they're more about identifying how elites work. Then, of course, you have class theory. What are classes? How do classes emerge? How do they function? The most obvious example is the Marxist viewpoint, but then there are challenges to that as well. For example, there's a libertarian version that defines class in terms of those in the state and those outside the state, or tax consumers and taxpayers, or net producers and net parasites, or whatever. That's just one viewpoint. And then, of course, you've got a lot of the ideas that the modern left has developed, intersectional theory, and then even conspiracy theory. If you look at conspiracy theories, a lot of those are actually pointing to something that's real, even if they're laying on, adding on all these different layers of things that are more dubious. So you can theoretically take all of these kinds of ideas and fuse them together in some particular way, and you could say, well, this is how systems of power and domination actually work, from the point of view of an anarchist critique. And then I'm sure you could have variations of how, what the particular narrative is going to be and what the focus and emphasis is going to be.
Right. Now back to the sort of the circular firing squad. The joke is anarchists are like, leave me alone, except when I need to correct another anarchist for thought crime.
Yeah.
So give some historical examples of anarchists doing this, because this isn't a new thing. This isn't something that we just saw, at conferences or bookstores.
No, you've had this going on as long as there have been people who identify as anarchists. In late 19th century America, there was an effort at one point, I don't remember the exact year or date, but there was an effort to create a gathering where there would be a meeting to build anarchist unity. And one of the first controversies that came up is that there were people who invited Benjamin Tucker to attend this. Benjamin Tucker was an individualist anarchist. And there were other people who objected to this, saying, no, he's not a real anarchist. He's a capitalist, or he's bourgeois. And then another person that was initially invited was Johann Most. He was a German immigrant. He was an anarcho-communist. And there were people who objected to him, saying he's not an anarchist. He's actually just a communist. He's a Marxist. And what was ironic, though, was that both of them refused to attend, Johann Most and Benjamin Tucker, on the grounds that the other was invited. That's and that goes on today as well. Just recently, there was a large anarchist gathering in Switzerland, and it was to commemorate the founding of the first Anarchist International back in the 1870s, the 150th anniversary of that. And there was a controversy over who was allowed to participate in this particular gathering, who could hold workshops. And of course, you saw a lot of the conventional controversies that are going on today coming out, where you had people that objected to the inclusion of libertarians, or people that objected to the inclusion of people that were conspiracy theorists, or the inclusion of people that were anti-vaxxers, or all the things that people argue about in today's world. So this is a long-standing issue. It hasn't changed much, in the last 150 years.
Now, the other issue is something you've brought up before on your own work, is the idea of the hyphenated anarchist, because usually whatever's hyphenated with anarchism eventually over time takes precedent. The good case being in World War I, Benjamin Tucker and Kropotkin threw their anarchist principles out the window and supported the Entente. Or in the American Civil War, William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, who was also an anarchist, threw it out the window when Lincoln declared he was going to end slavery.
Yeah, that's another thing it's been common throughout anarchist history. You'll have a situation where some anarchist individual or group sides essentially with whatever state they think is least objectionable, or whatever ruling class faction they think is least objectionable. In the Civil War, as you mentioned, I don't know if William Lloyd Garrison claimed to be an anarchist or not, but he had ideas that were similar. But yeah, he was definitely pro Civil War. Interestingly, Lysander Spooner was not. Lysander Spooner was a hardcore abolitionist, and he was a Northerner. I think he was from Connecticut. But he had been an abolitionist and an anti-slavery lawyer for years. But when the war started, he was like, no, I don't advocate war between states. I favor, runaways I favor the Underground Railroad. I favor abolition and all of that. But not wars between states. And you always have this split among anarchists whenever a big situation like that comes up. You have those that sort of remain pure and those who compromise. World War I, but Kropotkin becoming a Russian patriot in World War I was interesting. Tucker was a Francophile. He had a huge admiration for the French culture. The way that World War I was sold among the Allies was it was framed as a war for democracy against Prussian militarism. Whether it was or wasn't is maybe a separate question, but that's how it was framed. Of course, I don't know how that would lead Kropotkin to defend Russian nationalism in that framework, but that happens all the time. During the Cold War, for example, Rudolf Rocker, who was a leading German anarcho-syndicalist from the interwar period, he became a staunch Cold Warrior against Stalinism. And you find people from the other perspective. I've come across anarchists from the left who think that the wrong side won the Cold War. So you find these kinds of interesting compromises or co-optations all the time, and you see it today too. Every election that comes up, I come across self-identified anarchists who say, "Well, yeah, the Democrats really aren't anarchists because we've got to vote for them anyway because the Republicans are fascists." And then you see the same thing among some ANCAPs and right-wing anarchists. They'll say, "Well, no, of course we don't really like the Republicans, but we've got to vote for the Republicans because, the Democrats are communists. What are we going to do?" Now, I think a lot of that is just really an exaggerated and frankly ignorant understanding of how American political culture and American state and American ruling class, American economics actually works. I mean, there might be some circumstances where an outlook like that is warranted, like in Weimar Germany or something, but those are rare situations. But you do find that. You do find quite a bit of compromises. And you find a lot of anarchists that are interested in anarchism because they do attach it to whatever their favorite cause is, or their favorite lifestyle interest, or their favorite identity group, or their favorite economic system. I've come across, for example, a lot of labor-oriented anarchists that they really only care about syndicalism and the one big union and the IWW. They could care less about any other kind of anarchism. You have some like Noam Chomsky that are basically just functional Democrats, whatever they may be theoretically. And you find equivalents of that among right-wing anarchists as well. I know people on the right that are self-identified anarchists. To me, they just strike me as like Fox News Republicans or something. It's, but yeah, so you find this everywhere. It's nothing new.
So here's a question. Now, obviously, one common retort is this is just the moral failing or foible of each personal anarchist who does this, which might very well be true. But also, given that anarchism is a relatively young belief system, to what extent do you think this is the result of anarchism not being fully developed yet? Because if it's a new, young belief system, relatively speaking, it's only 150 years, 200 years old, and if it's not fully developed yet, it might be the case, plausibly, that you think other beliefs are adjacent and compatible when in fact they're not. And that's only made aware through trial and error. A good example would be social communism, because the anarchists that were portrayed in Russia and Spain. You've complained before about talking to them, saying, but no, you don't agree. The communists always stabbed you in the back. So they thought there was some compatibility, right?
Right.
And that compatibility was proven to be illusory based off of real world experiences. So to what extent do you think this is an explanation?
Yeah. Well, I think the issue is, like I said before, when anarchists will side with whatever ruling class faction they think is least objectionable. But a lot of that, I think, is based on a poor calculation of how statecraft actually works. In the case of Marxists, one of the first things Marxist states have done historically is put anarchists in jail, if not shoot them. So I think I'd say if you really think that communism is the way to, meaning Marxist-Leninism or something similar, if you think that's the way to advance anarchism, you're probably barking at the wrong tree. I think over time, if you saw anarchist movements grow to where they were large and influential, like let's say that in a single country, a third of the population identified as anarchist, I think you would certainly see larger and smaller factions. I think you would certainly see some traditions or tendencies within anarchism that were larger and more influential than others. And there would be various historical or situational factors that caused that, whereas others might be more marginal. For instance, in Spain, in early to mid 20th century Spain, you had a very large anarchist movement. And I personally think that the reason for that is that it was a substitute for the Catholic Church. I think that Spain having traditionally been a very religious, Catholic-oriented society, and the common people having become extremely alienated from the Catholic Church because the Catholic Church never did anything for them. So I think that anarchism and probably some of these other radical philosophies like socialism and communism started to function as substitutes for Catholicism. And I think that that's probably true in some other situations as well, where whatever traditions people hold to are viewed as having failed or being obsolete or not working, so they adopt some radical philosophy as put in its place. So yeah, but I think that in America, if you ever had an anarchist mass movement in America, it would probably be a lot different than what you saw in Spain. Spain, I think, was also heavily rooted in these peasant communal traditions that you find in a feudal society, but that you don't find in a Western industrial society. Anarchist mass movement in America would probably be something more like individualist anarchism. It would probably be closer to something like Benjamin Tucker. It might have a quasi-socialist dimension, and it might have a more laissez-faire dimension as well. But I suspect something like individualist anarchism would be the furthest, would be the type of anarchism that would probably go the furthest in the United States. Now, that's not true of all cultures. I think that in Japan, a type of anarchism that emerged there would be much different in character than what you'd find in the United States or China or perhaps India or one of these places.
So let me ask you this then. Do you think that there is a potential future in which anarchism is clarified in such a way as a theory that certain beliefs which are now considered compatible or adjacent are later seen to be rejected?
Oh yeah, I'm sure there would be, because that's just how philosophies develop over time. Now, again, a good example is the church. There were a lot of things in very early Christianity that were later rejected by the established church. Then when the Protestant Reformation came along, there were a lot of other things that they rejected about the Catholic Church. They said, well, no, we don't really think that's Christian either. So I'm sure anarchist movements would develop in a similar way. They would identify certain things as having not worked in the past, or just simply not theoretically or philosophically compatible with anarchism. I think that as far as what would be rejected and what's not, I think that remains to be seen, because movements take on a life of their own. And I don't know that my point of view would necessarily be the winning team. Like, let's say we had an anarchist mass movement in North America. Well, I don't know that Prestonism would be the dominant currency at all. It might not be. It might be some fringe tendency that's viewed in the same way as the Church of Scientology or something, But so I think that what is considered appropriate and what's not is always contingent on circumstantial factors.
Okay, we have a question/comment in the chat, which I think would be interesting to see how you'd respond to this. It's in two parts. If neo-absolutism is any indication, libertarianism that discovers human nature is antithetical to anarchism. Even though all neo-absolutist theory was based off anarcho-libertarian elite theory, is such a strong fundamental stopping point that it breaks down all hope for anarchism. So what would you say to the observer here?
Well, if I understand the question correctly, which I'm not sure that I do, but if I do, I think the question is that you have the rise of this neo-reactionary movement that's inspired by people like Curtis Yarvin, and along with that, you have the rise of people that are Catholic traditionalists, or people who believe in an absolute monarchy, usually fused with the church or something like that. I don't know that I don't see that as being a mass movement at this point. It just seems to be more of a cultural or intellectual curiosity, and it's sort of a fringe subculture that's really not any more significant than many other fringe subcultures that we have. I don't see it as becoming a mass movement.
So to jump in real quick, Keith, there's a point of there's 2 points of clarification that might help. I think what this guy is getting at is the idea that with elite theory, elites always organize. And so, it'd be like the iron law of oligarchy, right? Elites always tend to organize. And if that's the case, what does that mean for the future of anarchism? He also says neo-absolutism traces back to Hoppe.
Right.
So he's probably envisioning some sort of covenantalism.
Right. Okay. That's more or less what I thought. Well, that's an issue because as some of the Machiavellian political scientists have demonstrated, you do have this iron law of oligarchy, circulation of elites, 80-20 principle, which shows that organizations do tend to trend towards a pyramidal form of organization. And that's why I think it's particularly important to keep power spread out among individuals and groups as much as possible. A problem that I have, for example, with the direction that Murray Bookchin went in later in life, when he developed his philosophy of communalism, he started to reject the idea of localism and started saying, well, no, if we have a communal federation, we don't really want local groups to have the ability to secede, because what if they want to take the power grid with them or something like that? Now, to me, that is an important check on power. Like in the United States, if Texas or California or Chicago or Maryland were able to say, no, we don't like what the federal system is doing. We're just going to go, and they can do that. That is a powerful check on what those in control at the top level can do. And so I think that kind of ability to maintain checks on power is extremely important. And as far as these people that call themselves anarcho-monarchists, a lot of those are influenced by Hoppe and by some older thinkers like Eric von Kuehnelt-Leddihn, and I think the Circle Proudhon, and probably some older stuff. And the theory behind that, as far as I know, is you have people who are really just ANCAPs, who are into this idea of a covenantal community. And then you have others that are kind of like neo-feudalists, where their idea is they're going to have a federation of what amounts to autonomous villages, which are going to have some monarchical figurehead. The Holy Roman Empire, to some degree, was organized like that. It was a collection of hundreds of principalities that were largely just autonomous political units, and they had this interlocking system of law and mutual agreements with each other that were very similar to polycentrism or polyarchy. And then you had the emperor, who was theoretically the emperor, but he really wasn't much of anything. He was just sort of a figurehead. So I don't know, something like that, maybe a kind of quasi-anarchism that might exist, maybe not in that particular form, but and something comparable. But yeah, the iron law of oligarchy is a real thing, and it's a real issue.
I think one way to help explain this tension is there are certain strands of anarchism that are wedded to a certain kind of egalitarianism, and many of them are what we might call left libertarians. But both centrist libertarians, so that'd be like the Stirnerites and individualists and ANCAPs, and the right libertarians, which you see the anarcho-monarchists and the anarcho-nationalists, plus the religious anarchists, wouldn't necessarily have that commitment. They wouldn't necessarily have a commitment to egalitarianism. And I think also when we look at the rise of natural aristocracies, what like say the founding fathers talked about, say, men who get specifically skilled at a certain craft end up dominating that craft and become guild masters. But that's organic, right? Or you could say the formation of families is organic, with parents over children and husbands over wives. But what I think the anarchist would say, a non-egalitarian anarchist, is that iron law of oligarchy doesn't necessarily either justify or prove the state.
Well, there are different takes on that. Even a lot of the left anarchists recognize the legitimacy of authority in the way that's being described here. For instance, Bakunin, there's some quote from him about deferring to the authority of the watchmakers when it comes to making watches, because they actually know what they're doing or something. That's a paraphrase, but there's some kind of quote like that from Bakunin. I think Noam Chomsky once said, well, you have to differentiate between legitimate and illegitimate authorities. Like if a parent prevents a child from running out into traffic or something, that's coercion, that's exercising authority, but for a good reason. There's also the question of what does egalitarianism mean? That's never really been defined completely to anyone's satisfaction, no political scientist or anyone else. The main issue there, though, between the left and right anarchists is left anarchists tend to view market relations as a form of exploitation, whereas the anarcho-capitalists don't. And left anarchists tend to be bigger on social equality, like not ever making any distinctions between ethnic groups, religions, but ethnic groups, genders, sexual orientations, and that kind of thing. Right anarchists tend to be more of the view that it's okay to make those kinds of distinctions, or even to practice exclusion based on some of these characteristics, and at least in some instances. And I think that tension would probably always be there to some degree, because there's this question of, well, okay, a lack of equality is unacceptable. All right, so what about people who want to have inequality? What are you going to do about them? Well, we got to tell them they can't do that. But then you've got a system of authority. But one example I've used before, and I've debated some, excuse me, I've debated some left anarchists over this before. There's a place in South Africa called Orania, and it's an Afrikaner commune. It's an exclusionary white Afrikaner commune, and they are basically, South African nationalists. They consider themselves part of a legacy of the old system, the old apartheid system. And this organization exists completely independently of the state. It's economically self-sufficient as far as I know of. It's not dependent on welfare or something like that. And only whites are allowed to belong to this. And, well, not just whites, white Afrikaners. White Russians would be just as excluded as blacks would be. But so theoretically, this is, in some ways, this is sort of a proto-anarcho-communism. You've got this independent, autonomous commune. On the other hand, a lot of left anarchists would be incensed by the existence of a place like this because they view it as racist or fascist. But the paradox is, well, what are you going to do? If you think this is racism and fascism, you're going to say a place like this can't exist. And if you're saying they can't exist, well, then you essentially establish a state that's making a rule, saying that, these kinds of institutions, organizations, or forms of association are banned or not allowed. And how is that different from the state prohibiting something? So the debate between anarchists about what equality is, what freedom is, what a hierarchy is, what voluntary association is. I think that there's always going to be tensions there. I don't think that there's any way to entirely reconcile all the different viewpoints on that. I think, in an anarchist world like any other world, they just have to fight it out.
Well, I think also to sort of address this tension is Bakunin in his On What is Authority has this to say. Does it follow that I drive back every authority? The thought would never occur to me. Whether it is a question of boots, I refer the matter to the authority of the cobbler. Whether the question of houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of an architect or engineer. For each special area of knowledge, I speak to the appropriate expert. But I neither follow the cobbler, nor the architect, nor the scientist who impose upon me. I listen to them freely and with all the respect merited by their intelligence, their character, their knowledge, reserving always my incontestable right of criticism and verification. I do not content myself with consulting a single specific authority, but consult several. I compare their opinions and choose that which seems to me most accurate. But I recognize no infallible authority, even in quite exceptional questions. Consequently, whatever I respect I may have for the honesty and sincerity of such an individual, I have absolute faith in no one. So it's not that there's no authority per se, right? It's that we're talking about, can these authorities impose on you costs that you didn't consent to, externalities, right? So I think between, say, radical egalitarianism on the one hand, some acknowledgement of the iron law of oligarchy on the other, and some sort of radical statism on yet another hand, what needs to be kept in mind is that anarchists within the history of anarchist tradition, authority as such isn't rejected. It's the authorities that seek to impose externalities on other people without their consent. So the natural aristocracy that, say, an Enlightenment intellectual like Jefferson spoke of isn't ipso facto illegitimate. It would become so should these aristocrats somehow acquire the means to externalize their costs of what they do unto other people.
Yeah, well, a simple way of framing it is, with left-wing anarchism, how do you prevent that from becoming a socialist state? And with right-wing anarchism, how do you prevent that from becoming a traditional oligarchy or traditional aristocracy? So you have the same problem from both directions. I tend to favor, in any kind of society, I tend to favor a balance of power between all kinds of groups and individuals and organizations and institutions and communities and that kind of stuff. Because I think that creates an equilibrium where all these different forces constrain each other and no one is able to have absolute power over anyone else. And in particular, it's important to have decentralized political systems that don't provide avenues for power seekers to gain power easily, where if they want power, they're really going to have to work for it. So I think that's an important issue. I mean, there's many other questions we can talk about. There's the issue of if you have a anarcho-syndicalist worker militia that goes on a strike against an anarcho-capitalist business, who you're going to side with? Who's being most anarchist? I guess a sterner right would say just let them fight. And whoever comes out on top gets to keep the means of production.
And then Keith, the Buddhist anarchist, would say, all of this is illusion. It doesn't matter.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And then the primitivists would say, well, why are you fighting over a factory anyway? Yeah. So, the way I approach this kind of stuff as an anarchist theorist is I try to be as empirical as possible, in terms of what would actually happen, or what is the greatest probability, rather than something that's prescriptive or normative. The idea, well, I think if you did this, you're going to get these kinds of results, or you're obligated to do things this way. I don't really approach it from that angle. I tend to approach it more from the point of view of, well, these are the facts we can discern. If this kind of action were to be taken, it probably would produce these kinds of results, but then you have this kind of problem, and then there's the way around that might be this, but then that's going to create this other problem. So I tend to take this kind of operational approach. And a lot of people that are into radical politics or social theories or whatever take the opposite approach. They tend to be very prescriptive or very normative. They'll say, well, you must have this kind of system, you must do things this way, and you must have these rules. If you do that, then everything's going to turn out correct, and that's your moral obligation. And I don't really take it in that direction. I tend to take it very much from the opposite direction, more of an empirical approach. One big question I'm interested in is, let's say anarchist movements, broadly defined, and cousin ideologies along with them, grew to the point where collectively they were the world's largest collection of political philosophies, just like monotheistic religions are the world's largest collection of religions. All right. If that happened, what would be the implication? And what would that look like? How would it happen? What would be the implication for what kind of institutions there would be? What would be the implication for what kind of culture or cultures you would have? What would be the implication for all kinds of topical issues? How would education be done, for example? What kind of family arrangements would there be? Would everybody be a vegan? It's all these different questions involved in that. And we do have some real world prototypes we can draw on for, the monotheistic religions are a good example. Okay, they are the world's largest collection of religions. So what do you see? You see there's multiple religions. Within each one of them, they have multiple traditions. Within these multiple traditions, within each religion, you have minor traditions, and then minor traditions, and and then fringe groups and cults and sectarian groups and heretics and all kinds of things. And I think that anarchist philosophies, broadly defined on that scale, would function in a similar way. Another example would be something like restaurants. Look how many different types of restaurants there are with all different kinds of foods. You have vegan restaurants. You have, ethnically themed restaurants. You have places that sell nothing but junk food, nothing but diet food. And you find that among subcultures. Look at how many internet subcultures there are. Look at all the different kinds of youth cultures there are, like, the goths and emos and heavy metal or punk rock or something like that. And anarchism, on a mass scale, I think would be something like that. And then some. It would be on all different kinds of things, many of which would not recognize each other as legitimate. Some would be larger and more popular than others.
All right. Well, we're about at the end of everything. Is there anything else you want to add to that before we wrap up?
Well, there's an interesting book about anarchist history I'd recommend called Demanding the Impossible. It's by an English philosopher named Peter Marshall, and he takes the kind of open-ended historical narrative that I was talking about. He goes back and talks about quasi-anarchist traditions in ancient philosophy and in indigenous cultures and pre-modern societies and some of these medieval movements I was talking about. He talks about Greek philosophy, and then he gets into the early modern period and the Enlightenment and sort of the proto-anarchist thinkers from that time period. Then he talks a lot about classical anarchism. And then he brings it all the way up to contemporary times. He mentions Derek Jensen, who's been on your show before. He mentions Crime Think, which is a contemporary anarchist group. He talks about anarcho-capitalism and the Libertarian Party. So that is the best book that I know of on anarchist history and theory. Now, some anarchists, of course, don't like that book. They think it's too broadly defined. They say, oh no, anarchism is really just the anarchist internationals from the late 19th century, or it's really just anarcho-syndicalism. But then that gets back to what we were talking about.
All right. Well, thank you, Keith Preston. This is Todd Lewis, the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.